Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel. College football on the docket today, and some massive matchups that'll have seismic impacts on the chase for the college football playoff. We'll get to all four of them throughout the course of the show. I am, of course, your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined, as always, by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider.
I can't believe this is college football week 10 already.
Yeah, but is it really week 10? I mean, the Pac-12's week 1, the Big 10's week 3, so week 10 feels like a little bit of a stretch.
It's week 10. We start when we start. But
just be honest,
it's going to certainly linger on longer than we are typically used to.
I was going to say, be honest, you're pretty excited.
You thought I was
about
going somewhere else with that, didn't you?
No. No, I thought you were going to be pretty excited about regular season podcasts going all the way into December 19th or whatever it may be.
Fun times talking a little college ball.
So it'll be interesting to try and see, but I think a lot of us are excited not only for the Pac-12 to get going and see how quickly they can eliminate themselves from college football playoff contention like they do every season. You got a little MACtion tonight with 6 games on a Wednesday. We are officially in the full throes of college football. And Payne, things, honestly kick off on the national landscape as early as Friday. And we've typically broken down the Bet the Board top 10 that folks can always check out at Outkick to see how we view the landscape compared to the national media. And BYU has very much been entrenched in there since about week 4, week 5?
Very early on. Big fans of their offensive line. Big fans of Zach Wilson. So we've been adamant that BYU is one of the better teams in the country. We'll find out, obviously, Friday night. It hasn't changed. They're still in the top 10. And if you win this one and run the table, it'll be interesting to see if it's BYU who maybe sneaks in the playoff or if Cincinnati keeps this hot streak rolling. And I know you're not a fan of the Bearcats, but boy.
Well, I mean, I'm going to be honest here. I did lean Memphis last week. I'm glad I never actually got to the window with a ticket on Memphis because I could have ripped that thing up by halftime. So thank you for talking me off that particular ledge.
They're just so physical. And you think about the teams in their conference that might actually give them a chance in the matchup. The teams that can give them a chance are teams that have to be able to throw the ball. And Cincinnati's pass defense is fantastic. So the matchup isn't even good on any of the possibly good teams that they would face in conference.
No, they play a little bit of bully ball, and I think it makes it tough for a lot of the other teams in the American Athletic Conference to match some of their physicality. And while it's not quite an apples-to-apples comparison, it's a lot of what Boise State did so well under Chris Peterson in terms of forcing teams in the Mountain West to try and get in there in the trenches where Boise State always had an advantage. But it begs the bigger question when you look at Cincinnati and BYU, and of course we'll preview BYU Boise State in just a matter of minutes. Cincinnati and BYU, if they were to get into the college football playoff, I mean, do they even have a snowball's chance against an Alabama, a Clemson, or an Ohio State? Or is it one of those things in a disjointed year that if we don't have a clear-cut number 4, that, hey, you know what, let's give the little guy a seat at the table and see what they can do in a one-game setting where theoretically anything could happen?
It's certainly a long shot, right? The talent discrepancy is through the roof, and we've just long understood that college football is about acquiring talent. But in a year like this, I think it'd be fun to let one of them in. Right? We already have Georgia with a loss. We already have Florida with a loss. It's got to be someone that comes in. We don't know if there's really anything out west. We don't even know if they'll be able to finish all their games based upon, the time of them starting the season and how many games, if someone important on a team has to be out for COVID, right? We're kind of seeing with Wisconsin right now. Their horse goes down and we're kind of punting games here. So,
well, Wisconsin right now, to the Badgers' credit, they're on a trajectory to try and get to the Rose Bowl with a 3-0 record. So they'd love nothing more than to go to the Rose Bowl at 3-0 and to take on a 2-1 USC team to be the perfect cherry on top for what has been a topsy-turvy Big Ten, Pac-12 type schedule in the year 2020.
Yes. So, under that scenario, I wouldn't mind seeing little brother sneak in there, whether it were BYU or Cincinnati. Now, I think Cincinnati's probably got the more complete team, but Zach Wilson is flying up the draft boards right now. I recently saw him projected to the Patriots in the top 10. His skill set potentially could help match against a better team. And I think possibly, the way he's playing right now, he's got a chance, I guess, an outside chance to vie for the Heisman title.
When you mentioned Zach Wilson, though, and some of his skill sets, I know coming into last year, a lot of people compared him to Johnny Manziel, which I think probably a little bit unfair because Wilson seems to have more intangibles. He's definitely a better leader. I mean, if you're trying to come up with an NFL comp right now for Wilson, who does it ultimately become?
Tough to say. I would guess, and he doesn't have quite the wheels, but I would say Kyler maybe.
It's all about the headband, isn't it? That's what makes you put those two guys on the same level.
I actually think if you were to break it down like piece by piece, Zach's probably the more accurate passer. Kyler probably has the better arm. Kyler a little bit faster. But Zach can still be very efficient on the ground. Zach Wilson's game right now is just off the charts. When we broke down this Boise BYU game last night and I was digging around, I was like, yeesh, this guy's damn good.
He has definitely taken advantage of a pretty favorable schedule so far. So hopefully he can meet some of those high expectations when he takes center stage on Friday night. And when you look at this game, Payne, BYU, a 2.5-point road favorite at FanDuel. Total on this game, 59.5. And when we set the table for this particular matchup, I think folks on the East Coast and throughout the SEC and ACC don't know how much of a rivalry this has really become over the last couple of years. BYU and Boise, more or less fixtures on one another's schedule. I think they'll play every year up until 2024. They'll take a year off, and then they have another 10-year contract in place. This was a game, to Boise State's credit, that they actually fought to get put back on the schedule. When the Mountain West was going to come back with just a conference-only schedule, they worked hand-in-hand with the league and BYU to make sure that this game could happen. And I think we're all going to be thankful for it when we get to see them play. The Mountain West, to their credit, also allowed San Diego State to play a non-conference game against BYU, which will come later on in the season. And when you look at the way things have played out here, BYU has lost 5 games at Boise. I don't believe they've ever won on the Smurf turf. 3 of those by a single point, and 2 years ago by 5 points, where the final drive came up about 5 to 6 yards short. You look at the series, Boise State has a commanding lead. And it's funny, you read BYU's player comments all week long. They see Boise right now as their 3rd biggest rival, behind only Utah in the Holy War and, of course, Utah State, an in-state rival there as well. But it'll be the first time when these two teams will actually meet, when both teams are ranked, and BYU will officially become the highest-ranked team ever to go into Boise. When you look at the way BYU has played a pretty favorable schedule, how as a handicapper do you even go about trying to assess them against a Boise team who, let's be honest, they haven't been tested either. They beat up a bad Utah State team, and they took care of an Air Force team who they were able to run and gun with last week, even with a backup quarterback.
It's extremely difficult, and that was part of the handicap that I struggled with a little bit, because you start to go down this wormhole, specifically with Zach Wilson, who we were just talking about a few minutes ago, and it's like, this kid can do everything. He can throw it accurately, he can run it, he's been lights out throwing it deep. And you look at some of his numbers, it's like, wow. Wilson's got an adjusted completion percentage of 81% overall. When the guy has no pressure, he's got a 143 passer rating. It's like he's out there playing a video game. And if you look, because he's really mobile and has good awareness, and I think that's kind of the one thing that I noticed with Zach Wilson a little bit. He's got great pocket awareness. He's starting this year to throw from all these different angles and levels, and his feet doesn't need to be set. You can tell his game's just gone to a different level. But even when he's pressured, his passer rating's 108 with the heat on. And if you look at when Wilson goes to air deep, so just throws that we chart of 20 yards or more, he's completed 22 of 31 deep throws. 3 of the 9 incompletions were drops. Only Justin Fields right now has been a better deep passer in terms of rating and completion percentage than Zach Wilson. And the interesting part about this is, you do some reading, and you had Jeff Grimes, who's BYU's offensive coordinator, he came out this week, and he flat out said, I haven't seen this from a quarterback since I was at Auburn when I coached Cam Newton and Cam won the Heisman. So this is kind of what we're seeing here with Zach Wilson. Huge test this week, obviously. Give some credit to Grimes as well, because I watched a couple of their games. I stayed up late at night. And what I'm seeing with the offense is Grimes is pretty good. He's using misdirection, which we like, using motion, a lot of window dressing. He likes to attack downfield. So that combination of Grimes and Zach Wilson, I think they're in perfect unison right now offensively. But to your point here, there's some question marks about the competition, and they're completely warranted. The best defense BYU has played so far was last week in Western Kentucky. And on the season, the average efficiency rank of the defenses BYU's played, 84th. So, this is a step up in class for BYU. But the reasons we like BYU coming into the season, offensive line, right? They returned all 5 starters, 8 guys with starting experience. Right now, they've allowed Zach Wilson to limit pressure on 18% of his dropbacks. The O-line's doing a really good job moving teams around in the trenches. That saved us, I think, the opening game against Navy. We were really looking at Navy, Todd, and we're like, man, This matchup in the trenches here, this could be ugly. Let's keep off this one. BYU right now 27th in line yards. It's led to a really balanced offense. That's the thing with BYU. 10th in rushing EPA, 7th in passing EPA. Overall, schedule adjusted, 9th in offensive efficiency. And I think where the question marks we had, and this is the big matchup for this side of the ball, is coming into the season, Boise State's defense were a little thin along the defensive line. You had Curtis Weaver, who got drafted, led the Mountain West in sacks. 2 other guys along Boise's defensive line were second-team all-conference defensive linemen. They're gone. So 3 starters gone along the defensive line. The one guy at defensive end that Brian Harsin was like raving about all offseason was Dimitri Washington. He's out for the year with a knee injury suffered last week against Air Force. Harsin said that Washington's the team leader. So you're now out. You lost 3 guys year over year. You lost your best guy last week. And I get the numbers are probably a little bit skewed after an option offense gashed Boise. Not a shocker there last week. But through 2 games against lesser competition, Boise's 99th in defensive line yards, 91st in stuff rate, 79th in power success rate. So Boise's been pushed around in the trenches. If you can't stop BYU on the ground, you can't get pressure on Zach Wilson, like this is going to be a really, really long day. And if you look at some of these offenses, like Utah State, they don't really complete the forward pass. 101st in passing EPA. Air Force, obviously, right? It's this run-first option team. So this could be a little bit of a shock to Boise's system as well. The one thing I was reading, and I want to ask you this, there's 2 elements in this game that aren't necessarily on-field things, and you're better at gauging this stuff than me. But short week game, BYU already loses a day for travel. But then you had the NCAA come out and say with the election going on, there was a mandated rule which calls for no team activities on election day. So obviously it applies to Boise as well, but BYU is losing basically 2 days here on a short week. And then the second thing we know is this is going to be BYU's 8th game. It's only going to be Boise's 3rd. At this point, right, if you're BYU, you kind of know who you are. Boise State, not so much. Where do you see those kind of 2 things playing out?
Well, I think any time that BYU has one less day of practice probably helps them because Kalani Sitake can only screw things up on the sidelines. No, all kidding aside there, I think that part, the fact that they're on a level playing field in that regard, it's not that long of trip, but there's no doubt it takes away a little bit of your focus. I think the fact that you mentioned BYU playing its 8th game actually works as a disadvantage in this particular spot because BYU has shown a little bit more. And now maybe they've been vanilla in certain spots and they haven't shown everything in their playbook and arsenal, whereas Boise State, we're not even sure who's going to start under center for the Broncos going in. So when you're BYU and you're trying to prepare, whether it's looking at tape of Jack Sears in his 1 game as a starter or Hank Bachmeier and what he did last year as Boise starter, it gets to be a little bit more challenging in that particular regard. And now, thankfully for BYU, they haven't had to play 8 straight weeks. So there's been, I believe they have a rest here or there when you look at the schedule. So if they played 8 straight weeks, you'd worry about fatigue. But ultimately, I think it's a little bit tougher sometimes for teams that have put everything out there on tape. It gives Boise State the chance to prepare. But at the same time, you mentioned the key injury. I think it neutralizes some of that particular factor. And you talked about BYU and how good Grimes has been working with Zach Wilson. I was blown away, Payne, when I looked at some of these numbers. They've scored touchdowns on 62% of their first half drives. They've punted just 6 times on 40 first half drives. I don't care who you're playing against. If you're playing against air, unless it's 7th or 8th graders out there in Provo, you're still going to encounter a little bit of resistance. And when you score touchdowns on more than 51% of your drives, that tells you a thing or two about what they're capable of doing when you have receivers like Dax Milne and Gunnar Romney, who should be healthy, and a running back in Tyler Allgeier, who's been outstanding. Now, on the other side, the one concern I do have is with BYU defensively. I think this was one area we weren't sure what we were going to get from them. They were tested to a certain extent by Houston, but ultimately found another gear in arguably their toughest game to date. Boise State has a running back conundrum right now. We're not sure if George Holani is going to be their leading back. He left the Air Force game in the first quarter after just 2 carries. Van Buren fills in. But I don't get the feeling that Boise has the same skill position talent that they've had in the past, especially at pass catcher. There's not a guy like a Dante Pettis walking through there that's going to put a lot of fear going over the middle or over the top against this BYU defense.
What a nice guy. Uplifting Dante Pettis on the same week he
got cut. Yeah. You know, talk about salt in the wound. Dude gets absolutely flattened on a kick return, and the 49ers don't have healthy bodies, but somehow he becomes the one that's ultimately expendable. Poor guy had to pack his bags. Hopefully he finds work somewhere else.
It's shocking because we've heard about what a great route runner Dante Pettis was, but it just hasn't clicked yet. So, you know, I think your point is well made. There isn't a lot of data on Boise, right? Just with 2 games under their belt, and then they had 2 defenses they played that were outside the top 70 in efficiency. You know, we know Hank Bachmeier, Boise starting quarterback, didn't travel last week. It's an undisclosed injury. He didn't practice Sunday or Monday this week. Tuesday, there was no practice with the election thing. So, you know, we're not quite sure. Is it Bachmeier, you know, or is it Sears? I think we're probably going to know more this afternoon if Bachmeier can't go. You like Jack Sears. He's the USC transfer 4-star kid. I think you're a little bit higher on him than I am, but I did go back yesterday and watch the Air Force game. Sears was good, right? He opens up the game with this play-action bomb to C.T. Thomas, which I think really set the tone there. He was inaccurate on 1 pass all day, 4 for 4 on deep balls. But again, it's Air Force's secondary. They see the option all day at practice. So, you know, throwing isn't something they're great at defending. And if you look, last year Air Force was 85th in passing success rate defense, outside the top 50 in explosive pass defense. Through 2 games this year, Air Force is outside the top 50 in passing EPA defense. So I do think this is obviously a little bit tougher of a secondary and defense to pass on. One thing that we've seen with BYU, right? They've been, you know, I think significantly better defensively, especially towards the back half of last season, and what they're doing so far this year, even though they haven't been tested. But what we hated was BYU's defense, how conservative it was. They were playing like, you know, rush 3, drop 8. They've transitioned away from that a little bit. BYU still isn't overly aggressive, right? They don't send a ton of blitzes. They don't, you know, play downhill as much as they should. But they're still not on their heels as much as they were, you know, at the early part of last season. They do a better job getting natural pressure. If you look at sacks, which isn't a number that I love to look at, but so far, you know, more sacks this season in 7 games than they had all last year. Now, again, BYU hasn't played an offense right now inside the top 50 other than Houston, who you mentioned. And, you know, Houston moved the ball a little bit there. The average efficiency rank of offenses BYU has faced, 84th. But I do think in my heart of hearts that Sears is a tiny downgrade at quarterback. You mentioned Holani last week, left the game against Air Force, banged up, have to monitor his status there. Boise could be without their lead back as well. I think it was a game-time decision listening to Harson's presser yesterday. What you're going to have to watch for here is if Boise can run the ball, they're going to have a chance. Boise right now, number 1 in line yards on offense, but if they can't run, then you have to let Jack Sears at least throw efficiently on early downs. It's the one area where BYU's defense is just average because they do play some zone. They do play a little soft coverage. If you can get Sears comfortable with the early down throws, BYU 51st in the country out of 101 teams in early down passing EPA allowed. The key for BYU, you know, get Sears in known passing situations. Right now, BYU's defense top 25 in adjusted sack rate on known passing downs. Boise's offensive line, 82nd in sack rate on allowed passing down. So, you know, for me, like anything can happen, obviously, in a 60-minute sample. But when I dug into this game, I felt like BYU had an advantage on both lines of scrimmages. You know, 4 of 5 offensive linemen from last season for Boise are gone as well. We talked about the key defensive departures. So that's really what's interesting here. It's a tough game to handicap. And you look at this, Boise State has been favored in 121 of their last 122 games since 2001. So, when you look at this, you're like, man, is there some value here if you can get 3.5 on Boise? Or are you saying to yourself, this line is pretty telling, knowing that this is just not a spot that Boise has been an underdog in very often?
I mean, you can go back, and of course, the historical sample size here is irrelevant, but it's just to kind of create a little bit of perspective. You can go back to 1993, Payne. Boise State's been an underdog a grand total of 44 times. And when you look at how they've performed in that role, 29-15 against the spread. They've won 20 of those games when catching points outright. We've talked about them at great lengths being the giant killers, and you're not going to get a Power 5 team most likely coming in here as highly ranked as BYU. This ultimately gives them a huge opportunity to try and make a statement. And in regards to Jack Sears, let's be honest. Sears could have gone 40 for 40 against Clemson, thrown for 8 touchdowns, but if he didn't have a win over Florida State to his resume like Hank Bachmeier, you were never going to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Hank Bachmeier was a true freshman, winning on the road.
That may have had more to do with Florida State's conditioning throughout the second half and Willie Taggart doing Willie Taggart things. Before we close
Curtis
the book
Weaver
on
ate up our offensive line too.
And before we close the book on this Friday night game, did want to ask you a little bit about this particular number. We saw a variety of shops actually use Boise State as a short 1-point home favorite.
Yes.
We knew that number wasn't going to last before it ultimately settled in that 2.5-3 range.
I'm honestly not sure where this line goes. So 1 was a bad number. Especially, we're higher on BYU than just about everyone. So, made it like 3.2. So I'm pretty comfortable with where the number is. The total is interesting because, as you alluded to, I think BYU is going to have an advantage in the trenches. Neither of these teams has really played stiff competition. You like Jack Sears. If they allow him to throw on early downs, that'll be a positive. We're seeing this total tick up. It makes sense, but little weather potentially in the forecast. Now, I know this is Friday, but when I looked this morning, about a 45% chance of rain, some light winds. So we'll have to monitor that. This is the one game where there's just so many question marks. I'm not 100% certain where this line's going to go, and I can typically, sniff this out where they're going to be heading.
The always dreaded in November wintry mix in the forecast. I will say this game, as much as some of them that we've seen throughout the course of the season, live betting could ultimately be your friend. You're going to know pretty quickly if BYU has an edge on both the offensive and defensive line. I don't think it'll be as apparent as the Navy game, but that could give you every opportunity to potentially add to a position should you not take a stance before the game kicks off. But from Friday night into Saturday, where we're going to see a lot of conference races begin to take shape, and one of the bigger games on the docket in the Big Ten, where Michigan goes on the road to take on the Indiana Hoosiers. You're looking at Michigan, a 2.5-point favorite at FanDuel. You do have to lay a substantial price tag, so more or less a soft 3. Total in this game sits at 54.5. And I think a lot of folks, Payne, when they saw this game on the schedule, they figured Michigan would be the team coming into the contest 2-0, not the Indiana Hoosiers. And when you read some of Tom Allen's comments, he said, hey, look, we believe our Hoosiers can be better. I wasn't thrilled with the execution in the 37-21 win over Rutgers. Let's call a spade here. You have your biggest win, arguably, in the last 30 years in program history. You not only go on the road in conference and win, you ultimately cover the number against a Rutgers team who was playing with a little bit of confidence. When you look at Indiana, they're 3-1-1 against the number versus Michigan.
Did you let Tom Allen know that? Did you send him a note and say, listen, bud, you exceeded expectation in a shit spot. Be happy.
It's always funny because we take that stuff for granted, but the regular casual fan or even some of the talking heads out there, they don't place nearly the same value. I think for you and I, when you see steam against a game and you see a team go out there and win, that's more impressive to me than anything else. Than if you're a 42-point favorite and you win the game by 5 touchdowns. Like, hey, that's what you were supposed to do. You did your damn job.
Exactly. Those are the things that I kind of always look at, right? If the sharpest bettors and the market is saying, hey, this is ugly, this isn't a good spot, and we knew it wasn't a good spot, and you can exceed expectations knowing that, it's always a positive sign for me. That's for sure. And it was early. Yeah. They got out early. It wasn't anything where they looked overly laxed early on in the game, and then we saw the offense start to improve a little bit in the late second quarter, and it transitioned into the second half, which I think is going to be beneficial for this matchup.
I would, however, encourage all of our listeners who didn't happen to see the highlight. I think it circulated throughout social media. You sent it to me as well. The lateral play that ultimately could have given Rutgers a backdoor cover. The play didn't stand, but it's well worth its watch because you want to talk about potentially a heartbreaking bad beat. That would fall into that particular classification. Yeah. You mentioned the Indiana offense, but Payne, for this game, I actually want to start on the other side of the ball with Indiana's defense matched up against Michigan's offense. When you look at the Hoosiers, they've been extremely stingy this season, holding opponents to just 2.3 points in scoring opportunities. That's good for second best in the Big Ten. All the talk has been about Indiana's secondary and how well they're playing. Tawan Mullen, Jalen Williams, and Reese Taylor have been a breath of fresh air for a team that, quite honestly doesn't recruit athletes at the same level. Meanwhile, on the other side, I think all of us were enamored with Michigan and how good the offense looked in its debut against Minnesota. Suddenly, those expectations get tempered when you watch Talia Tagovailoa run up and down the field, leading Maryland's offense against the aforementioned Minnesota defense. And suddenly, Joe Milton runs into a little bit of a struggle against Michigan State. So when you look here, does Indiana's defense actually have the edge over a Michigan offense, still very much trying to figure out its identity with a young starting quarterback?
My expectations were tempered after I dug into the box score a little bit and actually watched Joe Milton. I think we talked about that last week. Eventually, he's going to face a defense that's going to make him throw. That's kind of what we saw in the Michigan State game. Now, he was good. It was the ancillary parts around him that weren't up to snuff there. But even in that Minnesota game, he wasn't really challenged. He only had to, drop back and throw it 10 times without RPO or without play action. He wasn't very good on those. I believe he completed 4 out of 10. So I was kind of hesitant to anoint Milton anything. I think we broke that down a little bit at the top of last week. But for this one, if Michigan can run the ball, they're probably winning this game. The way to beat Michigan is forcing Joe Milton to be a passer. So this is going to be on Indiana's DC, Kane Womack, to figure that out. He's going to need his corners, as you alluded to, have played fantastically to this point, to play on islands so Indiana can load the box. It's that simple because, Indiana, in my mind, won't be able to stop the ground game playing it straight. If you look, the Hoosiers right now, 93rd in the country in standard down line yards, 80th in stuff rate. If you look at defensive early down rushing EPA allowed, Indiana's 94th. It's an undersized Hoosiers defensive line that I think probably will need numbers in the box in their favor, especially when you consider Milton using his legs efficiently, right? Creating that extra man in the box advantage in the run game, that's difficult. So you're going to have to allocate more guys down into that box. If Michigan's ground game is going, then it's just tough because it allows Joe Milton to pass comfortably. He's going to be able to use the RPO. That becomes much tougher to stop if you're playing, run. Michigan will be able to use the play action pass more. And I think that's where Milton's at his best, throwing with RPOs, throwing with play action. Extremely small sample, obviously. But through 2 games right now, when Milton throws with play action, completion percentage is 18% higher. His passer rating is 50 points better. His yards per pass attempt increased more than 4 yards with play action for Joe Milton. You're going to have to force him to be a pocket passer in these known passing situations. That's the way you're going to stifle Michigan's offense. It sounds easy, but it's difficult, obviously, if you're an undersized defense that can't stop the run, which then makes second and third down more manageable for Milton. So that's what you're going to have to watch for. Again, Michigan's running the ball here. They're probably going to win this game, and that's what it's going to come down to. Can Indiana force them to pass the ball? And it's really that simple.
It's going to be interesting because if Indiana really does have a trio of corners that they feel comfortable putting on an island, it may allow them to commit 8 guys to the run game to try and do that. And I think early on you're going to get an indication of exactly how confident they are in those particular coverage abilities because, yes,
it's not just
Penn
the
State,
corners either. Like Michigan doesn't really have great receivers right now after Nico Collins opted out.
Right, it's taking Ronnie Bell out of the mix,
Yep.
and if you can neutralize him, then go, all right, we're going to allow you to beat us with our secondary options and a young quarterback who hasn't shown the touch that you need to try and consistently move the chains unless there's a busted coverage here or there. And to Indiana's credit, the Rutgers game is what it is. Other than that busted coverage late in the game against Penn State, they were pretty good down to down. Yes, they gave up 10 to 15 yards here and there, but they made Penn State methodically move the football. And as we've seen in college football on the whole, a lot of teams, if you force them to get the ball into the red zone, you can hold them to field goals rather than allowing them to operate with a full field. But on the other side of the ball, when you look at Michigan, Payne, they couldn't prevent big plays against the Spartans. They allowed 14 of Rocky Lombardi's 32 pass plays to go for 15-plus yards. They've struggled on that side by Don Brown's pretty high standards, not getting pressure on the quarterback. They're 8th in yards per play allowed and 7th and 3rd down defense. But I look at Indiana, and we had high expectations for Michael Penix coming into the season and what he was going to be able to do with a pretty experienced receiving core. Whether it's Penix's ineffectiveness, whether it's their inability to sustain stuff on the ground, you don't want to blame it all on a change in offensive coordinator, losing Kellen DeBoer to the head coaching position at Fresno State. But Nick Sheridan, and whether it's lip service or not, said, hey, we think we found something in the third quarter in the win against Rutgers. The success rate suggests they do. Can they carry it over here and provide a balanced attack against this Wolverines defense?
This needs to be the coming out party for Indiana's offense. You know, we had such high hopes coming into the season with Penix back healthy, and you have Wap and Stevie Scott, and even Peyton Hendershot is a very good tight end, and a few other pieces that, you know, through 2 games haven't quite clicked yet. Maybe it has to do with the change. And you know, it doesn't seem like it's a different offensive system, but there's always going to be little tweaks and quirks with a new guy. And it's, you know, you had the shortened off season. So you're, you know, learning some new things, and that's probably it. But you mentioned this, Indiana's offense got going before halftime, carried that through the third quarter against Rutgers. But in this one, like, Indiana's offense has to come out from the onset and score some points. I know the defense is experienced, but Indiana was supposed to be this, you know, team that was led by the offense. Michael Penix and the receiving group right now need to create some big plays through the air. Between, you know, Jemin Green and Vincent Gray and Jalen Perry, the 3 corners for Michigan that have played the most snaps, they've given up a combined 2.8 yards per route run through 2 games. Michigan right now 48th in the country in defensive passing EPA. And, you know, I've kind of been mentioning EPA a bunch, but if you're, you know, first-time listener, EPA is basically expected points added. Let's just call it like it's a measure of where you are on the field and how many points were expected to be added by the result of that play. So really, in its easiest form, like, EPA is a combination of success and explosiveness combined. So, you know, we thought Michigan's secondary was a bit thin coming into the season, and through 2 games, you know, serious question marks for Don Brown's secondary. Last week, we saw Michigan State explosive play rate was 11%. It's crazy. So to me, I think it's important that Penix is accurate with the deep ball. I think we saw a couple misses there early against Penn State that were like, damn, that would have changed things a little bit there. So I think there's going to be some opportunities. Penix has missed some wide open shots. If you're looking through 2 games, Penix has a 30% adjusted completion percentage and a 38 passer rating on throws of 20 or more yards. Not going to get it done. You're going to have to hit some of those this game. We talked off air a little bit, Todd, the other night about, like, you know, where's Stevie Scott been? So far, not the season he's hoped for. If you're looking, it's probably because of the Hoosiers' offensive line. They've been, let's just put it this way, not good. And that's why Stevie Scott is not having some success early. Indiana, 100th in line yards right now. They're getting absolutely no push in the ground game. Indiana is also dead last in the country in opportunity rate, which is the percentage of carries that gain at least 4 yards. And, you know, that's considered doing your job as an offensive line. If Stevie Scott in the ground game can't get going, then it puts more pressure on Penix to throw a little bit more with pressure. And Penix has struggled with pressure right now. He's damn good when he's kept clean, but Penix right now pressured on 38% of his dropbacks, just a 41 passer rating with heat on. So, you know, to me, this side of the ball, it's Penix has to have a good day through the air, hit some explosives. There needs to be just enough balance with Stevie Scott in the ground to where Michigan's defensive line just isn't like eating and pass rushing all day, and then maybe you have a shot. I'm just really intrigued to see where this line goes. You know, I can tell you that Michigan closed a 2.5-point favorite at the Sharp Shops at Minnesota. And as poorly as many of these underlying metrics are for Indiana, and that's the reason why we've at least seen some early money on Michigan, and some of these metrics are pretty ugly, but I don't make Minnesota a favorite over Indiana on a neutral, Todd.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit more on the philosophical side here. When it comes to assessing 2 stocks, we'll call them what they are, when you have 2 data points. We know Indiana took money against Penn State. We were obviously on them, gave them out as the best bet in the opener. They got us there outright despite a statistical margin that I think a lot of people who didn't watch the game would go, hey, look, you guys were pretty fortunate to even get that cover in that spot. Versus a Michigan team who went from being on top of the world with a dominant road win against Minnesota, College game day in attendance, to losing to an in-state rival yet again, quite frankly, as more than a 3-touchdown favorite. If we make a case for Indiana, theoretically, are you buying stock at the top of the market? Or can we also take the flip side approach and say, hey, look, if the names on the jerseys were reversed, Indiana could theoretically be a 3-point favorite given their body of work and some of their underlying metrics, despite not all being as positive as we'd like them to be.
Yeah, it's a really tough game for me to gauge. I thought I was going to have a better handle on this one. I initially went in like saying, hey, I think I might like Indiana here. But then some of these underlying metrics, like they just haven't been good. But it's clear there's a lot of room for improvement as well. And that's kind of what's keeping me off Michigan, because I wasn't a believer in Michigan like many others, right? We talked about this. We had people coming out and be like, Joe Milton's the next Cam Newton. And like Don Brown's defense is just electric. I don't believe in Joe Milton as much as others as a passer. Now, he might not have to execute that here. And I don't think Don Brown's defense is as good as other people believe it to be. There's some serious concerns in that secondary. And if you even just look at how Don Brown operated towards the back half of that game, like he took his corners off the line of scrimmage. No more press. He went with 2 high safety look over the top because he doesn't think he has much corner. So there are some matchups here where Indiana has a chance. And if we start to see them, because this isn't the offense that we expected, yet they're still 2-0. So that's why it's so tough and difficult for me to gauge. I probably not going to have a single cent on this one, Todd.
Yeah, I think this is one of those games you watch early on Saturday and you get a pretty good idea of where these two teams are. And if Jim Harbaugh's seat wasn't hot enough losing to Michigan State, you go on the road and lose in Bloomington.
What
all
happens?
Of a sudden,
they can't possibly fire him with a loss here, can they?
No, I don't think they fire him in season, but you begin to wonder, is he ultimately going to be the guy for this job? And what direction do you go in? Because maintaining the status quo is great. Going 8-4 and 9-3 is fine. But you know what? Somewhere along the way, you have to bridge the gap, because the Big Ten East is one of the toughest zip codes to consistently win in. And as Ohio State recruits at a high level, building an absolute juggernaut there under Ryan Day's leadership, you're not going to be able to lure any elite skill position talent. And quite frankly, for the folks in Ann Arbor, and I can't remember who put it out there, and said Michigan right now is the same way Texas is. They have this superiority complex, but the performance on the field hasn't been there. And you can't lean on history saying, oh, look, you're a Michigan man, this or that. You have to beat your biggest rivals. And for Texas, if you can't beat Oklahoma, year in, year out, and in Michigan, you can't beat even Michigan State, let alone Ohio State, Penn State, and everybody else. Maybe Harbaugh's not the guy for the job. I'm not going to fire him just yet, but I do think things start to get put under a magnifying glass and going to make a compelling case one way or another for that program.
It seems like the energy's already slanted that way that people don't believe he's the guy for the job.
Yeah, I think you lose enough of those games to your in-state rivals and some of the teams in the Big Ten East. It's not going to sit well or resonate, especially when folks can't be in attendance at these games. They're watching every single snap, and they see you drop a game as a 21.5-point favorite in your own building. So time will tell on Coach Harbaugh. From Big Ten country, though, we'll head down to, well, not quite your neck of the woods, Jacksonville, Florida, for the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, where Florida and Georgia will renew their annual rivalry, and this time it's Georgia, a 3.5-point favorite in this game at FanDuel. Total sits at 52.5. And when we look at this particular matchup here, I think the most logical place, Payne, will be to start with good on good, which would be Florida's offense against Georgia's defense. Georgia has won and covered 3 straight in the series. Florida, though, had been on a 3-game winning streak before that. I think the biggest question is Dan Mullen going to bust out the Darth Vader costume, when these teams get announced and he comes running out of the tunnel at TIAA Field.
He's a quirky dude. He incited that riot at midfield because he didn't like how Kyle Trask got injured, and then he shows up to the post-game presser in the Darth Vader costume. He's a wild dude, man. But we're intrigued, right? Like, this is the matchup we've been waiting for since before the season. You get a top 5 offense in Florida against a top 5 defense in Georgia. Dan Mullen, obviously highly regarded offensive wizard. And then Kirby Smart gets this job because of how great his defenses are. Now, you dig into some of this history, and it hasn't been overly competitive between these two guys. Whether you look at both of them as head coaches, or you look at Kirby Smart as defensive coordinator, like, if you just look like Mullen versus Kirby and remove everything else, like whether it's Mullen at Mississippi State or Florida, going against Kirby Smart's defenses, whether he was a DC or a head coach, it's been a landslide. Like, they've faced each other 12 times, and Dan Mullen's offense hasn't scored more than 20 in any of those 12 recent meetings. And as great as Dan Mullen is, and you have Kyle Trask, he's been running the offense efficiently, stylistically, Florida's offense is way different than Alabama's. And you're kind of hearing that comparison a little bit. Like, Alabama had some real success throwing on Georgia. If you actually look, Florida's style is a little bit more attacking you in the pass game horizontally than it is vertically. Florida doesn't have those vertical speed guys that Alabama has. And what's really interesting is you start to dig into some of these numbers. A shade over 70% of Kyle Trask passing yards have come after the catch. And the one thing that I kind of remember popping onto my feed, Todd, a couple of weeks back was a lot of the analytics guys, and I know we joked about this, Todd, was saying that Kyle Trask hasn't really performed as well as you think. So I started poking around. And why they said that is because of all the run after the catch stuff. Florida's receivers, their tight ends, their running backs have forced a broken tackle on 24 of the 96 completions. Almost 57% of Florida's passing yards have come after contact. Kadarius Toney has been like the human pinball. I still can't even, like, that
Percy
catch,
Harvin Light, baby. Percy Harvin Light.
Yeah, I mean, that catch against South Carolina where he's just like bouncing off defenders, I can't even get that out of my head. But I bring this up because the one thing Georgia's defense does is, like, they're fundamentally sound. They tackle well. Georgia's only allowed 18% of receiving yards to come after contact. They are a sure tackling defense. Receivers have only broken tackles against Georgia's defense on 7% of their catches. This is why I think Dan Mullen's offenses have really struggled, against Kirby Smart historically. Doesn't mean that can't change here. And if you start to dig around, right, you have like Richard LeCounte, who's Georgia's stud safety. He's going to be out for this game after crashing the dirt bike.
What a brutal story. The bigger question, and you don't ever like to live in a glass house and throw stones. Why is a kid that has such a bright future messing around on that kind of thing with a potentially life-threatening injury? Thankfully, the worst seems to be behind him, but we're not quite sure when he's going to be back on a football field.
Yeah, tough, because when you look at this matchup, right, him being out is huge for two reasons. He's going to obviously be the guy that, gets Georgia into a lot of their defensive calls, that he's not going to be out there now. But more importantly, when you're going against Florida, you have this guy named Kyle Pitts, and he's tough to deal with, obviously. So now you don't have one of your best coverage safeties. And if you look at LeCounte, he's allowed less than 0.6 yards per coverage snap on 146 coverage snaps. LeCounte's only been thrown at 10 times. He's intercepted 3 of those. So, it's tough when you're looking at that part of the matchup. The other thing here that can probably help Dan Mullen's offense a little bit is you got to have a supportive ground game. That's part of Florida's offense that I think has been a little bit of a pleasant surprise. It's provided good enough balance. Not many expected before the season. But right now, Florida's offensive line 16th in line yards, and as a team, 27th in early down rushing EPA. So it's been balanced enough for the year 2020. Now, Florida's O-line isn't nearly as good as the one Georgia just saw last week in Kentucky. Kentucky actually pushed Georgia around a little bit for stretches in that game, averaged 3.2 line yards and a 46% rushing success rate against Georgia. I just don't think Florida can do that, but it's worth mentioning, especially since Jordan Davis, Georgia's nose tackle, is going to be out for this game. There's another defensive lineman out I saw as well, potentially, Julian Rochester. So yep. Georgia is a little bit undermanned there. Now, they have a slew of talent, and I'm not sure Florida's going to be able to push them around. But a couple key cogs are going to be out along that defensive line for Georgia.
You also lose another member of the defensive backfield, it appears, as well. I mean, most likely the number 2 aside LeCounte. Alongside him would be Lewis Sin, and he doesn't appear to be all that healthy, dealing with an ankle injury. So a lot of Bulldogs banged up on that stop unit, and not a team that you want to be without some veteran leadership for the reasons you mentioned. A guy like Kyle Pitts and Toney, and the fact that they've gotten production from Pierce. You don't have to worry about Trask running the football, obviously, by any stretch, but his ability to spread it out, hit receivers in stride. I always think that's funny because you talk about broken tackles sometimes, and that definitely plays a role more in the college game. But we see it seemingly every Sunday and a lot of times on Saturday. Quarterbacks almost get discredited by hitting their receivers in stride, allowing them to pick up those run after the catch, compared to throwing the ball at your feet where a receiver has to go down, and ultimately, cuts off some of the big play potential. You look at Florida this season, there's no doubt their offense has been explosive. They've gone 3 and out less than 14% of the time, and that number actually dips below 10% when you talk about first half productivity. However, Payne, football isn't just Florida's offense against Georgia's defense in this matchup. It's also going to be the two teams' weaker units doing battle, and that, of course, would be the Florida defense against the Georgia offense that, quite frankly, has looked like it's been stuck in neutral. We look at Stetson Bennett. He's yet to throw for 300 yards in a game. He has taken some shots on early downs. Even if they're not there, you'd like to see him go through the progressions and pick up 5 to 6 yards. Now, thankfully, he's not falling victim to the Carson Wentz syndrome where those balls are getting picked off. But take what the defense gives you. The problem I see, Payne, and when you look at Stetson Bennett so far, since halftime of the Alabama game where Nick Saban made adjustments, he's just 15 to 33 for 235 yards, hasn't thrown a touchdown pass, 4 interceptions, an efficiency rating a shade north of 81, which is downright brutal for those folks that don't follow it. And for the season, Bennett's overall efficiency rating is 134, ranks in the lower half of the FBS. But Florida's defense hasn't exactly been a brick wall. If you're Georgia, is it as simple as saying, hey, look, if we establish the ground game, we're going to have success? Or how do you go about building up Bennett's confidence to make this Georgia offense a little bit of a dual threat for Florida defensively?
You just really don't like Stetson Bennett.
No, it's not that I don't like him. It's one.
Give him a little slack here.
It's not that I don't like him. I think the bigger question, honestly, the bigger question I have here isn't it a reflection of Bennett. It's what's going on with Georgia's quarterback room. Because Bennett was only supposed to be a placeholder. They had high expectations for JT Daniels. People came after me. I said, you guys clearly haven't watched him at USC. I mean, this guy isn't going to be the savior at starting quarterback. And the fact that Daniels didn't get any time last week against Kentucky tells me this is Stetson Bennett's job, not only for this game against Florida, but for the remainder of the season, barring injury.
Yes, it seems to be the case. Now, you mentioned Alabama's defense with Nick Saban making adjustments at the half. No surprise there. And Kentucky's defense is really good. The only reason Kentucky isn't living up to expectation right now is the quarterback position. The offensive line's been fantastic. The defense has been really good. You just hope the defense doesn't wear out, because I saw that Kentucky's basically been on defense at an average of 71 snaps per game. So eventually they may wear out on that side of the ball. But when you're looking at the Gators defense, like Todd Grantham's going to have to figure out how to stop Georgia's run game. That's simple. Right, we've grown accustomed to these like great offensive lines from Georgia the last few seasons. It's happening again. We're talking about a team that doesn't really threaten you via the pass. Teams are loading the box, yet Georgia's offensive line is still 6th in line yards. So they're pushing people around in the trenches. What you have to like is that you did see Florida's defense probably had their best performance of the season last week, I would say.
Wasn't even close. Yeah. I mean, I didn't watch the game as I was texting you trying to find it. I'm still convinced that game wasn't actually televised anywhere, which in this day and age.
The alternate SEC network.
Which I have every damn channel known to man on DirecTV. Where the hell was it? Or did I have to stream it on some third-party web portal through Reddit?
So it wasn't on the SEC network, and then the alternate is like 611-1. I couldn't find it on there either. It was blacked out. So I had to do exactly what you said that you had to do there. I had to find like some sketchy link just to see what was going on. But the one thing the Gators did, they were fantastic defensively, easily the best performance they've had of the season, held Missouri to a 28% success rate, 3.5 yards per play. Florida's defense owned the trenches. And they really played on the other side of the line of scrimmage. Missouri literally had negative 1.7 line yards, and 40% of Missouri's runs were stopped at or behind the line of scrimmage. So it's a good sign that Florida's defense is at least trending well into a game like this. Now, huge asterisk with that performance, because Missouri didn't have their left tackle, their left guard, or their starting right tackle. So I think there is a little bit of an asterisk there. And on the season, you're looking still Florida's defense 94th in the country in rushing EPA. So they're going to have to figure out how to stop the run. And, even if Missouri's offensive line was healthy, it's not to the caliber of Georgia's. And so the key is obviously here is Georgia probably doesn't want to get in a shootout with Stetson Bennett. But I think there's probably going to be some nice opportunities for Bennett to make some plays here. Like Georgia's receivers are probably going to be open. Todd Monken is a good play designer. And when you look at Florida's secondary, there's some question marks there too. Florida's 79th in passing EPA allowed. So, Florida hasn't really been able to stop the run or pass. And if you look, the opponent average distance to go on third down, just 6.2 yards. The national average 7.1. So Florida isn't getting offenses to play behind the chains and be uncomfortable. You obviously want Stetson Bennett like attempting to beat you in these known passing situations. And if he beats you, you tip your cap and you move on. But, if you're Todd Monken, you're probably going to see some of these edges in the pass game because you kind of hinted at this, right? Like, Bennett wasn't just missing throws that he was making. He was missing guys that were open. So you don't want to, you certainly want to be efficient and throw the ball and hope that Stetson can make the right read. But the one thing you don't want to do is get sucked into calling pass all the time. We saw in the Alabama game that Georgia kind of lost their way. They got away from the run for some reason, even though they were extremely efficient running, especially on the inside zone stuff. Georgia can't do that here. They have to stay committed unless Florida is just absolutely, completely shutting down the run game, which is going to be tough to fathom. I know you don't like Stetson Bennett as much, and I think you were really right about that, but it just feels like to me that there's probably some meat on the bone left for Georgia's offense. I think we'll probably be able to see how confident Stetson looks early here. There's a reason, this line opened Georgia minus 4.5 and 5. We're now down to 3. There's been some early sharp money on Florida.
Yeah, and I think some of that sharp money, though, quite frankly, is because of the injuries.
Yes.
I can't imagine every odds maker knew that LeCount was going to be out.
Right.
And when we talk about certain players, not necessarily the Trevor Lawrences and the Justin Fields of the world, I mean, that's a massive loss, especially in this particular matchup, knowing that Kyle Pitts is who you have to scheme for and try and neutralize. And it's not with Stetson Bennett. It's not that I'm overly critical. I just think he's got to take what the defense gives him. And ultimately, the game slows down for these quarterbacks. Hell, I didn't play this sport. I didn't play it at a peewee level, so I'm not going to say what it's like. But you'd like to see a guy go through the progressions. And you know what? If that 15 to 20-yard deep shot isn't there, take 3 to 4 yards. Stay ahead of the down and distance. Georgia can pick those up on short yardage situations. One thing I will say, an injury to keep tabs on the offense for Georgia, George Pickens didn't travel to Kentucky. There's a lot of optimism that he might be out there. He, of course, is one of their more reliable, if not the most reliable options in the passing game. And defensively for Florida, I mean, they had rave reviews about a player named Kyrie Campbell, who they said gave their defensive line the opportunity to play with more size and disrupt Missouri's rushing attack. But you are going to be down a starting defensive lineman in Zach Carter and a backup linebacker in Antoine Powell for the first half because of the Missouri fiasco. And then the other position to keep tabs on, let's see who Florida gets back in their secondary. They were down 3 starting defensive backs in Wilson Davis and Steiner because of fallout from the COVID situation. They were also down backups. A lot of talk that those guys will be back, but as we know in this day and age, Payne, what happens on Tuesday and Wednesday may not necessarily be the case at 3:25 Eastern time, 5 minutes before this game is ready to go.
Exactly. And so, to your point, some of the matchups don't necessarily look fantastic for Florida, but you're getting potentially a boost on both sides of the ball, right? Georgia's losing some guys defensively. I do think George Pickens ends up going. And Florida's getting back some guys. You mentioned Kyrie Campbell. That was someone that we talked about early on in the season, right? He's on the roster still. He's supposed to be like their stud interior lineman, but he's not really. He's buried on the depth chart. So there's got to be some behavioral discipline things going on there. But they get him back, and he was absolute force against Missouri.
We just have to keep the Gatorade bottle away from George Pickens when he's on the sidelines in this particular matchup. The 3 games in the books. You, of course, can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. But for all those 3 games and the impact they could have on the chase for the college football playoff, this game, Saturday night in South Bend, may go a long, long way in terms of defining who we see as the top teams in America. And that, of course, is the Clemson Tigers taking their undefeated 7-0 record on the road to South Bend as 5.5-point favorites at FanDuel. Total in this game, 51.5, as Notre Dame welcomes in the Tigers, who, while being 7-0, just 2-5 against the spread, they've been absolutely dominant. 9-3 against the spread the last 12 on the road. 24-0 straight up. Last 24 conference games, 17-7 against the spread. But Notre Dame, no slouch in their own right. They'll put a 20-plus game home winning streak on the line. And 2 weeks ago, Payne, some books made the Tigers a 15.5-point favorite in this matchup, despite summer numbers holding steady in that 6-7 range. I guess the first question I have to ask, how big a drop-off is not having Trevor Lawrence in a game of this magnitude under the lights when you're going into hostile territory?
I'll be completely honest with you, and I'll be completely honest with our listeners, some of which know the stuff I bet, but I sent you a note last week And then I said, we're going to grab the points here before this leaks out. And then like 2 hours later, it got reported that Trevor Lawrence was going to be out with COVID. And I got to tell you, we saw the initial move down from like 31.5, 32 to 30. I texted you at 30, and it wasn't widely available. And we were stunned that by kickoff that they only felt, odds makers, that this was a 3-point downgrade. And it wasn't this wasn't going from like 4 to 7. This was going from like 24 to 27. So I am stunned at what the market felt like the drop-off was last week. This feels a little bit more in line with what we have the drop-off, especially when you consider this being the kid's first road start. So I'm intrigued to see where this line goes. My understanding is that at least early on, Clemson was going to be the sharp side, especially at 4, and we saw that. But as soon as this got to 7, that did not last. Okay? So I think there's potentially going to be a little battle here. Like, I think there's going to be some sharp guys on Clemson. I think if this gets to 7 again, you're going to see sharp guys on Notre Dame. So there's going to be a little bit of a battle here. My understanding, though, Todd, is that the one agreement here is probably going to be the under.
Yeah, early on, it looks to be
Yes.
that way, and I think there are a lot of factors that could potentially support it. And maybe that's a good place to start when we look at Clemson's offense with DJ taking the reins against the Notre Dame defense that has been nothing short of outstanding. When we look at Clemson this season, the offense has been explosive. It took them a half to get adjusted to the new quarterback. They clearly weren't as dynamic as we've grown accustomed to against BC, spotting them that big lead. You look at DJ's stat line, 342 yards, 2 touchdowns, completed 73 of his passes. Hey, look, that's great on the surface. And we know this kid from Inland Empire in California is supposed to be the next great quarterback in what apparently is going to be a long lineage at Clemson as long as Dabo Swinney is the head coach there. But I read some of the film analysis, Payne. They talked about how he was reluctant to throw to the left side. That won't be lost on the Irish. And when you talk about Notre Dame's defense, this is a stop unit that's allowed just 2 first-half touchdowns, 6 touchdowns all season long. It represents less than 9% of the offensive drives that they've had to deal with. They've been great against the run. They haven't played the most difficult schedule of opposing offenses, let's call it for what it is. But when you look at the Irish, they've been good when they needed to, forcing 3 and outs on nearly 1/3 of the drives, and they've kept their opponents' offenses on the sidelines. Opposing offenses have only run an average of about 60 plays per game against them. We've typically seen Notre Dame in these spots not have the athletes to match up against skill position talents for the Alabamas and the Clemsons. But without any inside intel, I don't have a direct line to any of the groundskeeping crew that we saw in the movie Rudy. I'd have to think we can expect a pretty slow track in South Bend come Saturday night to try and slow down this Clemson offense, even with a young quarterback under center.
I've never gotten your official stance on that. Was he offsides or not?
Oh, he was 100% offsides. He definitely lined up in the neutral zone, but I'm not going to take anything away from the kid. It counts as a sack in the stat sheet.
My understanding is he's still living that college legend dream, hanging around in the local bars there, huh?
I mean, what's the movie Can't Hardly Wait where the dude goes back? Or it's Matthew McConaughey's character in, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of it, Dazed and Confused. I keep getting older, they stay the same age, that type of mentality for Rudy Rudiger at this point.
That seems to be right. As I occasionally scroll the old TikTok, you're like, geez, man, am I getting old as I see these women out here dancing. Probably born about 15 years too early.
Yeah, most of them young enough to be your daughter, so
Yes.
Be careful there, would you?
Oh, if I had a daughter, I'd wring her neck if she was doing that stuff on there. Anyways, fortunately, I don't have to worry about that. I was thinking about this the other day. What are you going with if you have a daughter? Is she like in a cage until she's 18, or what's the
absolutely
protocol?
not. Absolutely not. You know how close I am with my sister?
Yes.
And my sister and your sister are wired about the same way. I actually felt bad for all the years for all the guys that my sister actually dated and went, hey, look, if you want to deal with my sister, knock yourself out because she is going to be a ball buster and a half. And when she went to school at Arizona, I mean, she was as close with some of the athletes that were there. And I think some of them, despite the level of success they achieved playing football or basketball, were legitimately afraid of my sister, especially when she had a few adult beverages in the system.
Love it. Absolutely love it. What are we even talking about here? Clemson, Notre Dame? Is that
Clemson's
kind
offense,
of a big
Notre
game?
Dame's defense. Yep, kind of a big game.
So, I think the questions you have offensively for Clemson right now, and when you have a quarterback like this making his first road start, is can you get some help from the O-line in the ground game? Can you generate enough push up front so Travis Etienne can at least be efficient here and you can remove some pressure from DJ's shoulders? Etienne is obviously, probably one of the best running backs in the country, if not the best. Nobody knows why the hell he returned to school, especially when you have to replace 4 or 5 starting offensive linemen. But Dabo's done a good job re-recruiting his guys. Let's put it that way. And when you look...
Well, you get paid more at Clemson if you come back to school than you do on a rookie contract in the NFL, right? That's how it works?
So Clemson right now is 36th in the country in line yards. And so they're not really getting that push up front you would hope. That's for sure. And even when you look at Etienne, right, 31st for Clemson in early down rushing EPA, 33rd in rushing EPA on all downs, because that O-line just hasn't been great, even with Etienne running behind it. I am not going to attempt to pronounce his last name, but obviously DJ making his first road start in what's going to be a pretty hostile environment. So he's going to need some help from the ground game. And you look at Notre Dame's defense right now, 3rd in the country in line yards allowed on standard downs, 13th in defensive rushing EPA, 11th in early down rushing EPA allowed. So, maybe when we flip the game on, you're going to see a massive talent discrepancy take over, Todd. But if you're just kind of looking at some of these metrics, you're not quite sure what Clemson's going to be able to do on the ground. But the numbers just don't insinuate that Clemson's going to be able to run it here consistently. And I think, when you're looking at this game, this is obviously Clemson's toughest challenge to date. Clemson, if you look at the defenses they've faced right now, average efficiency rank of 56th. And, that's me kindly removing Citadel from that situation. Notre Dame's defense, 8th in defensive efficiency. And what's interesting here is, maybe an element of Clemson's ground game that they didn't actually want to put on film, but they were forced to because they were, back against the ropes here against Boston College, was the use of DJ's legs as this extension to Clemson's ground game. So now it at least allows Notre Dame to prepare for that and get ready for it. Bottom line, right? You're looking at this game, 10 of 11 defenders for Notre Dame all have 3 or more years starting experience. That's big here. They're not going to get pushed around, I don't think, at least size-wise on the defensive side of the ball. It looks like an elite Notre Dame defense. The one area, and anytime we've talked Notre Dame, we've mentioned this, and it continues to be a problem, is Notre Dame's defense has been susceptible against the deep pass. The explosive passes have hurt Notre Dame. So DJ's going to have to beat Notre Dame, I think, over the top a little bit. If you can take a shot early and you connect, maybe that'll soften some things up for the ground game. But right now, in passes of 20 or more yards downfield, Notre Dame is giving up a shade less than 1 point per pass on those throws. So it's been pretty ugly. DJ right now, I guess, he hasn't been really asked to make many of these deep throws. Only 9% of his throws have been deep. Some of that, obviously, garbage time influenced. You're not bringing him in a 50-point blowout and being like, hey, throw the ball 50 yards down the field. So I expect that percentage of deep throws to probably increase. But so far on the times that he has thrown deep, just 33% adjusted completion percentage. And you mentioned some of those areas where he's had some trouble, that deep intermediate throw there to the left-hand side. We saw him, you kind of get accustomed to that being completed with Trevor Lawrence. He's sailed a couple of those. So to me, Clemson's going to need to be able to run the ball. Not sure they can. DJ is going to need to be able to hit a few deep shots. That's where Notre Dame's most vulnerable. We'll see if he can. But the biggest thing is, I think we'll know pretty early on if Notre Dame's just out-talented. My gut says that's not going to be the case, though.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that you have so many returning veterans on this Notre Dame side. Why is that important? Because all of these guys clearly remember what happened in the college football playoff in the Cotton Bowl back in 2018, a game where we did see that talent disparity. Clemson had the athletes that went absolutely bonkers, but without Justin Ross, who was unfortunately injured and we haven't seen him play a snap and won't this season for Clemson, you don't have T. Higgins. Amari Rodgers is a nice piece, but I don't get the feeling this Clemson receiving core is anything close to what we've seen in the past with NFL caliber talent there, at least on the outside, especially with some of the injuries they're dealing with. So we'll know pretty quickly how that side of the ball may play out. Obviously, there's another side of the coin, and that, of course, is the Notre Dame Fighting Irish's offense against Clemson's defense. And the Irish have been outstanding running the football, 230-plus raw yards in 4 out of the 5 games. The only time they didn't establish the run, I have to believe, was by design against the best defensive line they faced in Pittsburgh. But Ian Book, coincidentally enough, had his best passing game of the season. And when you look at some of Book's numbers, I mean, they've been pedestrian at best. 1,200-plus yards, 7 touchdowns, 1 interception. I'd love to operate under the narrative, Payne, that, hey, Brian Kelly, Tommy Rees, they've been vanilla because they haven't had to show a whole heck of a lot. Now, people who want to try and go, well, look, they only beat Louisville 12-7. There were some weather conditions there that probably prohibited Notre Dame from stretching the field. Is this the coming out party for Notre Dame from an offensive standpoint against the Clemson defense who, hey, Brent Venables does an outstanding job, but he is dealing with a laundry list of injuries, not only to starters, but some of their depth guys as well.
So 2 things, because I wrote this down and then forgot about it, but you mentioned some of the receiver injuries for Clemson. True indeed. And then you had Frank Ladson Jr. on Tuesday suffer a hip pointer in practice. So they could be down potentially a couple guys in that receiver room for Clemson, which would be huge. Then you mentioned the weather in the Louisville game. Yes, 25 mile per hour steady cross-field winds with gusts even higher, plus you had Pittsburgh on deck. Listen, in general, we talk about this, whether no matter the side of the ball, the fear of backing Notre Dame is reasonable, right? They aren't just like spots that we have seen where they have really done well stepping up in class, going against these elite teams. The number is 4-40 straight up for Notre Dame against the AP top 10 in their last 44 tries, and the Irish have only covered 25% of those games. So, again, explain some of that early money that we have seen on that side. But again, I think we'll know pretty quickly if there's a talent disparity here. But again, I go back to this. There are some metrics here that I think at least lend themselves to Notre Dame having some success. Clemson's defense, we knew coming into the season, had to be rebuilt a little bit, lost a lot of talent. Now the injury bug is kind of bitten Clemson's defense. Now Venables is like this defensive wizard. So despite losing some of these guys to the draft and then injuries, Clemson's still 10th in defensive efficiency, but this is a big step up in class. If you look, Clemson hasn't faced a top 40 offense this season. The 6 FBS offenses Clemson's faced right now, average efficiency rank of 67th, Notre Dame 16th, and you're hitting this right on the head. There's a lot of speculation that's going around in terms of Notre Dame's offense that they've been holding some things back, which we actually saw in the Pittsburgh game. They unleashed some things there, and it looked completely different. So the offense was a little bit more open in the Pittsburgh game, and I think we actually kind of said, hey, it's going to be a little bit more open here. So we'll see if Tommy Rees does the same thing in this spot. If you're looking at Book potentially airing it out down the field, he doesn't do it a lot, even though the pass game was a little bit more sophisticated in Pittsburgh. 18 of Book's 150 passing attempts have been 20 or more yards down the field. There's obviously going to be a fun battle up front. Clemson's D-line, still an absolute force. They've just recruited at that position at a ridiculous rate recently. Clemson right now, 8th in line yards, 4th in stuff rate. So, Notre Dame's offensive line with who they're projecting 4 NFL guys along it, they're going to have to, at least stalemate that battle, win it a little bit. That's a good matchup. Can Notre Dame's offensive line get enough push for Kyron Williams? So far, done a good job. Notre Dame right now 11th in early down rushing EPA. It's allowed the offense to stay ahead of the down and distance, 6.5 yards to go, the average distance on third down for Notre Dame's offense, so that's a positive. We'll see if that remains the case here, because I think there probably are some question marks still about Book. But if you're Notre Dame's offense, the fear I think you have is Clemson not feeling threatened by your receiver group. And that's been the question mark all season. And that's the question mark that was Miami's problem against Clemson, right? We're not sure Miami's got the receivers. And sure enough, Venables comes up with this game plan where he's able to stack the middle of the field, stop the run, spy the quarterback, take passes away from the tight ends over the middle because he believed his corners could win outside one-on-one. And that might be the case again here with Notre Dame. Notre Dame's receivers are going to have to win outside a little bit here. I think Book is obviously going to have to play big, connect on some deep shots. He's going to have to be good with pressure because right now, Book's been a little bit more pressured than I thought he would be. He's been pressured on 33% of his dropbacks with that good offensive line. which is pretty surprising to me. Now, books dealt with pressure pretty well. 112 passer rating, adjusted completion percentage of 73%. But the key here is, again, Notre Dame's receivers have to win. If you're getting put in these known passing situations, the offensive line just hasn't been as good as we thought in pass protection. Clemson's been able to get after the quarterback a little bit there. So, this is a little bit more of a tougher matchup than I thought. I initially went into this on the side that, man, this is a lot of points. But then you break this down a little bit, and your hope is that Notre Dame's held some things back offensively, because what we've seen so far is they're uber reliant on the ground game. And if they're rolling on the ground, then Notre Dame's going to have a chance to stay within this number. If not, then there's a lot of pressure on Ian Book, and we've seen him crumble sometimes in these bigger games, and we're just not quite sure of what Notre Dame has outside at the receiver group.
I don't think they have much. I mean, there's no Chase Claypool. There's no Cole Kmet. I mean, no knock on Ben Skoranek, whose name I'm butchering, a transfer from Northwestern. When he becomes your best vertical threat, it's a little bit problematic in my opinion.
Yes, and by the way, just a heads up, the San Francisco 49ers game, off the board.
More COVID stuff?
Yeah, apparently Kendrick Bourne has tested positive.
Good work out of Kyle Shanahan. I picked up the phone, called Barry Alvarez, go, hey, how do we get this game scrapped? Okay, good. We're going to go with the COVID storyline and be able to make it work.
That's fun.
But Thursday night football. So you know what, Payne? The only good thing about that, if I'm trying to find the silver lining, is it means the Mountain West takes center stage, and you could commit all of your TV viewing resources to watching Utah State at Nevada and Wyoming and Colorado State for the border war.
Wyoming looked pretty good there against Hawaii last week.
Sure did. Put together one hell of an effort. Hawaii looked like they had no part of wanting to perform in cowboy country. And I was actually joking with one of my buddies, when you look at some of these conferences, not to go off on a tangent, can you find two programs in the same league that are more different in terms of overall culture, climate, and everything else than when Hawaii plays Wyoming annually?
No, you can't. And I think Hawaii tried staying up there, and it just didn't seem to materialize. That's for sure. Trying to get acclimated, and it just didn't work.
Stayed in the Rocky Mountains. It didn't quite pay dividends. But either way, we go off on a tangent with the Mountain West. Yeah, this Clemson Notre Dame game.
Full of shit.
Great movie reference. Thought the Rocky Mountains would be a hell of a lot rockier than this. When you look at the game, I'm actually with you. And we talk about it all the time. And I think some of our listeners who are new to this particular trade, especially when we have brand new states opening up in Tennessee where they can deposit money into their FanDuel sportsbook accounts, don't know that, hey, look, you look at a number and ultimately it suggests one thing. This number we've seen, as you talked about at the top of the breakdown, two very different schools of thought. Some folks wanted to run and lay it with Clemson, say, hey, look, they're favorites for a reason. But when you got out there, went, wait, pump the brakes a little bit, the underdog has some value. I'm going to be curious to see what we ultimately have in terms of a game day move and where this settles. Because when you sit in that 5.5, 6 range, it gives the bookmakers a little bit of flexibility. Do they want to just hover between 5.5 and 4.5, knowing that it looks like it's going to be a relatively close 60-40 breakdown on tickets? Or will we see 6.5 sleek or fall down to 4, maybe even 3.5? Going to be interesting to watch the cat and mouse game taking place in the betting market, since this will be the most heavily bet game of the entire Saturday slate.
Yeah, I think you're probably, as crazy as it'll sound, you're probably at a good number, right? Just depending on what information comes in moving forward. But I think probably if I'm looking at this, knowing that I got hit with sharp money at 4 and I got hit with sharp money at 7 the other way, you're probably going to sit here at like 5.5 or 6.5, depending on your viewpoint as a bookmaker.
Yeah, it's a great spot to be in. I mean, when you have the opportunity to inject a little bit of your opinion in, and
yes.
We've talked to John Sheeran as we do every single Thursday, and he continues to make our audience smarter. You like to do that. You go, hey, look, I'm happy to take a little bit of a stance, and if you think Clemson's the side, as much as you'd love to go, hey, Clemson's the side, we're just going to hang 7 and take as much dog money as we can. Anybody who's been behind the counter knows that's not quite the case, and you're not afforded that luxury most of the time.
Yeah, without question. Without question.
So, should be a hell of a game. 4 massive games to look forward to. And, of course, we kick things off in style on Friday night on the Smurf Turf with BYU taking on Boise State. But, Payne, we are not done here on this very fine Bet the Board podcast, college football edition, until we identify a best bet. And we are on a modest 2-game winning streak, one that I'm sure you and I, along with our listeners, would like to take to 3. Where are we going to try and make a little bit of scratch this weekend?
Let's go with a little night game in the ACC, Todd. Let's go with rotation number 331, the Louisville Cardinal, plus the 3. I just think there's some value here in this number. Probably a pick'em type game had last week's upset of North Carolina not occurred. And you look at some of the underlying metrics like net EPA. Louisville is significantly better than Virginia in that category. I think the offense is going to give Virginia some troubles with some speed on the outside. The key here is, can Louisville get a stop? And I think, sometimes they've been pretty good stopping the run when they are
might only need
loading
2.
the box. We saw it a little bit against Notre Dame. And I think the other discrepancy we both have here is Louisville has faced, in our minds, tougher schedule. So I think there's value in the number here. I don't mind the matchup. And that's basically it. I think we make this game pick. So taking 3 in that situation is something we're going to do every day of the week.
You're officially on the Mikhail Cunningham bandwagon after he sliced and diced your Seminoles defense, huh?
I was digging into some of the passing stuff as well there. A little surprising because my eyes don't tell me he's the greatest passer. Some of the efficiency metrics are not too bad.
Well, if you have wide open Tutu Atwell running through a Florida State secondary,
All right, let's not make this about Florida State. Come on.
Come on, it's 6 degrees of Florida State separation. It's an ACC game. How the hell were we going to try and get around it?
This is true. We had a very good week, right? We had the bye, didn't lose a game. Delvin Cook went apeshit. It was a good week for Florida State football.
A couple of things also to keep in mind for this game. Virginia loses one of its team leaders in a starting defensive end, Richard Burney. He's going to opt out for the remainder of the season because of a medical issue. Both Virginia and Louisville dealing with COVID situations. So for those folks who I'm sure are going to poke around and go, hey, are you guys worried about Louisville? They're going to be down a number of key cogs on their defensive line. Yes, we know there was money that came in against them last week with Virginia Tech getting bet up from 3 to 5.5. But Scott Satterfield, if you do your reading, has said, hey, look, this is the world we live in. We can actually prepare to be down a couple of those guys on the defensive line. And like you said, Payne, I think when you play some of the mobile quarterbacks and diverse running attacks that Louisville has faced, Brennan Armstrong and company may feel like it's a little bit slower motion than a Jordan Travis or Virginia Tech Khalil Herbert, along with Hendon Hooker, and of course the physicality that they encountered at Notre Dame and South Bend.
So you like it. I like it. We got agreement here on the Ville.
Yep, let's go. Is Rick Pitino still their head coach?
I got to tell you, if he was, probably a little better player.
On that note, Louisville, our bet the board best bet. Payne, you have anything else? Life advice you want to share? Homemade recipes? Cocktail suggestions? Anything?
May need a couple cocktails later this week, that's for sure.
All right. For Payne Insider, you can follow him on Twitter. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. We'll be right back with you, same time, same place tomorrow to talk a little National Football League. But in the meantime, come Saturday evening in Charlottesville with a Louisville ticket in hand. We'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.